today's jargon term is topography of behavior. Ooh, it's a good one, right? All right, so actual definition for topography of behavior, describing behavior in an operational context, free of coloration of values or expectation. Isn't that a lovely, lovely sentence? I don't know what it means. And I don't know what it means in terms of my child, right? But let's move on to our working definition of topography of behavior. It's describing behavior and thinking of it as just the facts, ma'am. Okay, so we've talked before about keeping a diary of behavior. And I'm doing my little origami project here. I'm folding a piece of paper into thirds here. And one of the things that I recommend is that when you've got an individual that you're working with on the autism spectrum and you're having some difficulty with some behaviors, that you give yourself this handy dandy little tool. There's not yet an app for this, but they're a plain piece of paper folded in three, right? We've talked about this before, the ABCs of behavior, 3 columns. There's an A, a B, and a C. The A stands for antecedent. It's what happens before the behavior. The B column is where you write about the behavior, and the C column is where you write about what happened after the behavior. What were the consequences for the behavior? Okay, so if this is all Greek to you and you've never heard this before, make sure that you look for a past spot where we talk about antecedent or where we talk about the ABCs of behavior. But right now I'm talking just about the middle column, the behavior. And this is where your expert is going to ask you to write the topography of the behavior. They want you to write, so let's say that for instance, my son used to do that. We would go to one specific store. We would get into the store and everything would be fine while we were with the fresh vegetables, but we would round the corner to go buy the seafood, and all what would break loose, and there would be a tantrum, and sometimes, there was one time when he turned over a shopping cart. Horrifying, right? So if this happens to me and I'm a mom, and this is exactly what they asked me to do, is to keep this kind of a diary. So I would go in, and the first thing I would do after the behavior is I would write what's fresh in my mind, which is the topography of the behavior. Later on, I go back and write about, okay, so what happened before and what happened after. But they wanted the topography of the behavior. So in this instance, I would write down that, and it's literally like thinking like a court documenter, and it helps you to stay calm, to think about it while you're watching it, going, oh, okay, so right now, he's making noises like, right? And I'm going to write down that, making short breaths and breathing between his teeth, just writing down what it is. Then I would write down, he tipped over the shopping cart. It continued on for 10 minutes. He kicked me. He attempted to kick one of the other people. He put his arm out and attempted to knock some salad dressing off of the shelf. I would just write everything that happened and how long it lasted in that B column. That's the topography of the behavior. Now, why is this important? And why is it important? Why don't we just say write down about the behavior, describe the behavior? Well, sometimes, and you will see this happen at schools all the time, that you go to school and you're at the IEP meeting and for instance, they're talking and somebody says, well, we're having a problem in the classroom. Okay, well, what's happening, right? We want to know the topography of the behavior. And somebody will say, well, he's not being very respectful of other people's spaces. Well, that's putting a judgment on it. It may not seem it, but if we dig further and say, well, what does it look like when he's behaving this way? Well, he's not listening. Okay. What does that look like? Well, he's not paying attention. Okay, well, what does that look like? Oh, he's not making eye contact with me. Okay. Okay, well, eye contact to some people reads as disrespect, but is it necessarily? No. Eye contact reads to some people as you're not paying attention, but is that what it really means with our kids on the spectrum? Not necessarily. He's not listening to me. Well, we do listen with our eyes, but just because someone isn't making eye contact doesn't mean that they're not listening and learning. So this is why we filter it down to the topography of the behavior. This is why we take all the emotion, all the judgments, everything out of it. What does it actually look like? We need to get to that point because we're not really going to address the issue if we're filtering it through all the things that we think, right? We want perspective taking, but not in this column. We don't want to know how you felt about it. That's for your diary, other diary, right? We don't want to know how crushing it was and that you thought you were never going to. No, that we want the topography of the behavior, because it's going to inform us how we treat this is going to be based on what actually happened, not what it felt like. Right? So if somebody says, well, he's not really respectful, how do we treat disrespect in our society, right? Versus how do we treat when someone isn't making eye contact? Vastly, vastly, vastly different. So this is why knowing what the topography of the behavior is important. For those of you who are parents, it's so super important when talking to experts to think in terms of that, even if they haven't said, well, what was the topography of the behavior? Because some of them go easy on us. You want to be reporting behavior in that way. You want to report behavior that way to your school officials, anybody who's dealing with your child. Take the emotion out of it, describe the behavior. You're going to get further and they're going to listen to you longer.